The dawn light spread slowly across the Serpent's Maw Basin, bleeding soft color into the low desert as wind stirred grit from the Echo Canyon Pass. Nothing moved on the surface but the drifting dust and the long black shadow of the Apache helicopter, the Desert Phantom crawling its way east. Its rotor wash pushed curtains of sand out from the narrow Viper Passage where Elara Thorne was flying, but otherwise, the sky remained empty, untouched. The aircraft kept low, hugging the terrain as if its presence were something uncertain. A question asked in the language of motion alone. Inside the cockpit, the glow of heads-up displays had been deliberately shut off. Targeting systems sat dark. Switches that would normally pulse with algorithm-fed angles and guidance indicators were quiet, their usual hum silenced by Elara's deliberate intent. She had disabled the fire control computers. Every line she flew now was hers alone, flown manually, without safety buffers, without lock-ons, without fallback. Her co-pilot, Captain Reese, strapped into the seat beside her, kept his eyes on the terrain ahead, but glanced over just once. He knew not to ask questions. He had already heard her say it in mission prep. They needed someone to draw fire. Elara had looked up from the flight table and said without blinking that she'd take it. Then she had asked them to shut off the limits. No predictive targeting, no safe standoff. She would handle it from the stick. Now the only voices in the cockpit came from the open radio channels. One belonged to Apex Command, clipped and cautious. The other came from a Desert Vipers team, calling in from the valley floor. They were pinned behind a rock shelf, unable to move without someone taking eyes off them. Everyone on the ground had been expecting cover to arrive from the air, just not like this, slow, exposed, and nearly silent. Elara responded to neither voice. She kept her hands light on the controls, nose pointed toward the northern ridge. Captain Riss relayed status when required, keeping things minimal. It had been quiet for too long. No anti-air batteries, no thermal ping, but that was the problem, and everyone knew it. Up ahead, the Crimson Ridge line cut clean against the early sun, a perfect arc of elevation and shadow, with enough broken terrain to hide missile teams. Apex Command suspected heat seekers, light enough to move, heavy enough to kill. They had seen what happened 2 nights ago when another bird took a high pass over that same sector. The wreck was still there. Elara dipped the Apache lower, letting it skim the curve of the basin as if it were no more than a ripple in the surface of a lake. The maneuver brought her dangerously close to effective launch range, but she didn't adjust. The angle was deliberate. The risk was part of the shape she wanted them to see. Captain Reese muttered under his breath. "Close. Keep watching the ridge," she said calmly. "They'll move." A voice from the Desert Vipers came back over the net, breath tight with tension. "We're still taking fire. We need her to push up, force their heads down." Elara didn't react. She kept her eyes fixed on the rock lines above where sunlight now licked at the cliff edge. It was too clean, too static. The silence had a waiting sort of weight, and she knew what waited inside it. She nudged the collective down a fraction, adjusting her trim, holding her flight path steady. Elara kept the Apache steady, its nose still angled toward the far slope of Crimson Ridge, her controls light. The desert ahead shimmered with morning heat, but no targets had lit on infrared. Just that same slow expanse of pale rock and dry wind, framed in a calm that didn't fit. The flash came from the left edge of the ridge, a blink of thermal light on the edge of the feed, there and gone. And then came the streak. A white line, a sudden roar. The missile tore down across the sky at an oblique angle, fired from a shaded launch point. There was no lock warning. Elara rolled hard left, punching collective and swinging the tail into the escape arc. She didn't touch the countermeasures. No flares, no chaff. That would mark her position too cleanly. Instead, she stayed cold, moving fast, counting seconds. The missile streaked past the tail boom, just as she snapped the bird low across a ravine, missing by less than the span of a rotor blade. The shockwave hit a second later, a bloom of pressure that rattled the cockpit. Captain Reese swore, bracing himself as loose dust rained down from the overhead panels. "That was one," he said. "I think 3 more behind that ridge." She banked again, pulling the helicopter tighter toward the far edge of the rock face, using the slope to block heatlock. Her voice was calm. "Mark the ridge." The system didn't mark anything. The targeting HUD was still off, but she saw it. She etched the ridgeline shape into her mental map. No computers needed. The radio crackled again with a new voice from Apex Command. "Eagle 2, abort your run and pull out to safe elevation." Elara reached over and killed the feed. She kept only one channel active, the one to her co-pilot. "We're going full blackout," Reese said. Elara nodded once. "They think they scared us off." The Apache climbed now, lifting just above the first shelf of elevation, slow and deliberate, mimicking a retreat pattern. But it wasn't a retreat, it was positioning. The second launch came late, fired at where the Apache had been seconds earlier. The trail carved upward and arced wide, missing by dozens of yards as the helicopter disappeared behind natural stone. They wouldn't try a third, not yet. That was what she needed. Elara eased the Apache into a high, slow bank, curling around the backside of the ridge like a drifting shadow. She stayed above their infrared threshold, just high enough to disappear. "They're going to think you ran," Reese muttered. Ilara's focus had already narrowed. She flew by instinct now, by the reed of shadow and wind and heat, curls off stone. The ridge that had looked so confident from the ground now sat exposed, its flanks etched into early light. What they didn't know was that she was no longer flying where they could aim. Elara tapped one switch to mute her own headset's background feed. Only one voice remained in her world, her co-pilot's. He was beginning to understand. She had been bait, yes, but not for them. She had been bait for herself. The Apache rose like a slow breath against the canyon's flank. Elara pulled the bird into the open sky, climbing along the edge of the bluff, banking tight to the curvature of the ridge. Most of the active displays had been powered down. Elara wasn't looking at them. Her eyes were focused beyond the glass, studying the distant rise of earth and cliff, reading wind patterns and angles of elevation the way others might scan a map. The climb wasn't just to escape, it was a shift in shape. The Apache was no longer bait. Now it was disappearing. Below them, the basin remained empty. The ridge itself had returned to stillness, but the shape of it had changed in Elara's mind. She knew where the launchers had been. The helicopter banked east and circled wide, moving with no lights, no radio transmissions, and no radar pings. She tapped one toggle, then another, disabling the last of the infrared tracking overlays. The feeds fell silent. Far below, behind the ridgeline, a foreign voice cracked through the monitor. Bird is gone," the voice was saying. Laughter close behind it. "Not stupid enough for another pass." Another voice answered. "Set next tubes, east shelf, reposition at the deadfall." Elara's eyes narrowed on the eastern shelf, a slant of tan rock cut with broken timber, ideal for concealment. The Apache turned again, slower this time, hovering for a breath. Below, the shapes of men moved, dragging equipment across a slope now fully exposed to the sky. Their heads were down, their attention pointed south, not up. Captain Reese leaned in. "They're resetting. They'll be hot again, in 30 seconds. Elara's eyes remained fixed. "They'll be dead in 20. He looked over at her. "We still cold." "We're ghosts," she said. Below, more voices came through the comms, cursing about wind direction and sightlines. Elara watched them with clinical stillness. She noted the spacing between them, the position of crates, the path one would take to rearm. Each piece locked itself into a picture in her mind, a clearer understanding of shape, rhythm, and timing. The Apache turned again, adjusting altitude in a shallow climb, settling itself into the curve of the wind above the ridge. Elara matched the turn with minor corrections, never reacting. The enemy team below kept working, making jokes about how the next shot would be easier. Elara toggled the radio channel off. The voices cut out. The quiet returned. The Apache floated at the edge of motion, not advancing, not retreating, just present, waiting. The enemy team settled into position, unaware of how long they had been under crosshairs that didn't need a computer to see. "You've got the angle," she said. "I already made the shot." The Apache hovered a breath longer. There was no sound when she fired. The Hellfire missile dropped clean from its hardpoint under the left wing and descended in silence. Its engine did not light until it was clear. The shot was manual, unaided. It was already mid-course by the time her co-pilot realized she had pulled the trigger. Far below, the enemy never saw it coming. The missile struck the ridge, a surgical impact. One of the men vanished in the detonation. Elara didn't watch the fireball. She had already rotated the Apache 45 degrees, tracking her second target line. Her left thumb pressed the fire switch for the 30 cannon. The chain gun barked in clean, rapid bursts. Not a spray, but a rhythm. 2 rounds walked across the rocky edge. The body language of the men below snapped into panic. Another dropped the tube and bolted. The Apache dipped lower, and Elara laid suppressive fire along the ridge's backside where a pair of crates sat. The next burst of cannon fire hit the crate's dead center. A chain of detonations bloomed from the rocks. An ammunition cache cooked off. The heat shimmer reached skyward. The enemy comms lit up all at once. "She's still up, still in the air. Where the hell is she?" Elara reached forward, flipped her mic to the open enemy channel, and keyed in. "Your trap needs work," she said. The words cut through the chaos on the airwaves, flat and unhurried. She fired the second Hellfire. The missile tracked the escape vector she had already predicted. It hit just behind them, throwing the entire slope into smoke and dirt. The ridge was quiet now. The smoke rose slowly now, no longer driven by shock waves or fresh heat. It curled upward in long, thin sheets over the fractured ridge, slipping past shattered stone and melted gear until the sky above was streaked with soft gray and the taste of metal. The wind had started to shift again, light and steady, sweeping west across the basin. In that quiet, the desert looked untouched, as if nothing had happened but time. Elara kept the Apache in a wide circling pattern above the kill zone. Her altitude remained steady, with no rush to reposition. Below her, the shapes of men had begun to move. The shadow links came first, small, fast figures, lifting from their concealed positions. They crossed the dry gulch in coordinated pairs, heads up, weapons angled, but no longer in combat posture. The Desert Vipers followed next, their movements more deliberate. One of them paused at the edge of the ridge, turning his head just long enough to glance skyward before stepping back into the flow of the team. They didn't speak into the comms right away. They didn't need to. Elara adjusted her trim slightly, nudging the helicopter's nose 2 degrees west to account for a tailwind. The rotors hummed in the same low, steady rhythm. Her hands remained calm on the controls. The Apache drifted in smooth arcs, always above, never intruding. The ridge below was hollowed out, with craters where the missile strikes had landed, and scorch marks where the cannon fire had cut through crates and shoulder mounts. There was no movement near the detonation sites, nothing that suggested recovery. No one remained to fire another shot. The radio crackled. This time it was a ground team leader. His voice was half lost in static and dust interference, but the message was clear. "Air team, you just bought us our legs back. Ridge is cold. Movement is green." Elara did not reply. Her co-pilot, still watching the ground through the side panel, let out a breath and leaned back against his harness. Then came another voice, lighter this time, almost casual. It came from one of the shadow links. "Whoever flew that bird," the man said, "we owe you a case of something strong." Elara reached forward and clicked her mic live for the first time since she had spoken on the enemy channel. "Make it 2, she said. The line went quiet again. Apex Command broke in next. "Eagle 2, confirm status, report fuel and damage." Captain Reese answered for her. "Status green. Bird is stable. We're clean." Elara turned the aircraft west, away from the basin, letting the horizon pull its color back from the sky. Behind her, the battlefield cooled. The dust would settle, the footprints would fade, but the silence would remain. The Apache flew slow and level. No fanfare, no markers, just one shadow moving across the desert's breadth. Unhurried, unbroken, and very much alive. The trip back to the forward staging site was a quiet one, a stark contrast to the controlled chaos of the last hour. Elara flew the Apache on a deliberately low and winding path, a signature move of hers. She was no longer a ghost. She was a legend. Captain Reese knew this without needing to say it. He watched the subtle movements of her hands on the controls, the way she made the massive machine respond to her will with such effortless grace. He had flown with many pilots, but Elara was different. Most pilots saw the sky as a canvas for their skill. Elara saw it as an extension of the battlefield. She wasn't just flying an aircraft, she was a part of the landscape, a natural predator moving through her territory. As they neared the staging site, the radio channels came alive again. The chatter was a loud buzz of confirmation and congratulation. A voice from Apex Command, no longer clipped and cautious, came through the headset. "Eagle 2, you're clear for landing. Stand by for debrief. Outstanding work." That was a textbook tactical maneuver. Reese acknowledged the message, but Elara didn't flinch. The praise meant nothing to her. She had done her job. The victory was in the silence, not the applause. She brought the Apache down with a smooth, silent landing, the rotors slowing to a gentle whisper as the helicopter settled onto the tarmac. The ground crew rushed forward, but Elara was already out of the cockpit, her gaze fixed on the horizon, not on the chaos around her. A high-ranking officer, a man in a sharp uniform with a chest full of medals, approached her. He extended his hand. "Pilot Thorne," he said, "that was unconventional. You disregarded our command to abort. You flew with no safeties, no system locks. What do you have to say for yourself?" Elara looked him in the eye, her face expressionless. "The mission was a success, sir. The targets were eliminated. The ground teams were saved." He nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing. "That's not an answer, pilot. You took an unacceptable risk. You acted on instinct, not procedure." Elara didn't raise her voice. "I didn't act on instinct, sir. I acted on information. I saw what your computers couldn't. I heard what your comms couldn't. I knew where they were and what they were doing before they did. The risk was in not taking the shot." The officer was silent for a moment. Then he looked at the wreckage of the Apache's external hardpoints, where the missiles had once rested. He looked at the helicopter, then back at her. "Dismissed," he said. Elara turned and walked away. Elara walked into the debriefing room. The air was thick with the scent of coffee and dry erase markers. A large screen at the front of the room showed a map of the Serpent's Maw Basin, with her flight path etched in a thin red line. A group of analysts and officers were crowded around the screen, their faces a mix of awe and disbelief. One of them pointed at the screen. She flew into a hot zone without a single system active. Her flight path was impossible. It defied every algorithm we had. Another analyst, a young woman with a sharp mind, spoke up. It wasn't impossible. It was a pattern. She read the battlefield like a book. She used their arrogance against them. She made them believe they had won, and then she vanished. She was a ghost, a phantom. The young woman's words hung in the air. The officers and analysts were silent. They had seen the data, but they hadn't understood the human element. They had seen the numbers, but they hadn't seen the ghost. Elara sat in the back of the room, her gaze fixed on the screen, her face unreadable. She had told them the truth. She had acted on information, not instinct. She had seen what they couldn't. But they still didn't understand. They still saw her as a rogue pilot, a maverick who had taken an unacceptable risk. They didn't see her as a strategist, a tactician, a leader. They didn't see the truth in the mirror. A senior officer, a general, walked into the room. The room fell silent. He looked at the screen, then at Elara. "Pilot Thorne," he said, "your actions were unprecedented. Your disregard for protocol was a serious offense. However, your actions also saved a ground team and eliminated a major threat. Your flight data has been flagged for further analysis. A team of our top analysts will study your flight path, your maneuvers, your methods. They will try to understand what you did and how you did it." He paused, then looked at her again. "You will be grounded until further notice." Elara's grounding was not a punishment. It was a transition. The military, in its vast, slow-turning machinery, had recognized a truth it could not ignore. The formal debrief concluded, and her file was not marked with a failure, but a cryptic phrase, "Retasked to Special Projects Division." The general, the same one who had initially grounded her, came to her quarters. He didn't offer a handshake or an apology. He simply placed a single leather-bound notebook on her desk. Its cover was blank, but inside, the first page held a single, hand-written note. "You were right. The next mission has no safeties. Your terms." Elara lifted her gaze from the notebook to the general's face. For the first time, she saw not an officer bound by rules, but a man who understood a deeper kind of war. He saw her, not as a pilot who broke rules, but as a weapon who made her own. The next day, a black, unmarked SUV waited for her at the edge of the base. She walked out alone, her small duffel bag slung over her shoulder. She didn't look back at the hangars, at the helicopters, or at the pilots who were now whispering her name with a different kind of awe. She was no longer a pilot. She was a strategist, a phantom, a ghost. The SUV drove her far away, to a remote, silent facility buried deep in the desert. Inside, a single vast room was filled not with helicopters, but with a massive holographic map of the world. It pulsed with light and data, showing every conflict, every potential threat, every unseen variable. Her new mission was not to fly, but to see. Not to engage, but to orchestrate. Her war was no longer in the air, but in her mind. Elara sat at a small, unassuming console in the center of the room. She was alone, but she was not isolated. Her touch on the controls was light, precise, and confident. She was finally home. She was a phoenix, rising not from the ashes of a destroyed aircraft, but from the silence of her own genius. Months turned into a year. The world was at peace, but it was a quiet, fragile peace. The threats were still there, but they were now met by an unseen force, On battlefields around the globe, in the dead of night, enemy strongholds would be neutralized, their forces outmaneuvered, their traps turned against them. There were no news reports, no hero pilots, no boastful speeches, just silence. The military, a vast, slow-moving machine, had finally learned to be a ghost. It had learned to see what others couldn't. It had learned to be a part of the landscape. It had learned to be a phantom. The young pilot, Lieutenant Evan Hayes, began to visit Elara daily. He would bring his worn notebook, filled with his own observations, his own attempts to understand her methods. Elara, in turn, would listen, her eyes fixed on the screen where the map of the basin was still displayed. She didn't offer advice directly. She didn't tell him what to do. She would just ask questions, simple but profound. What did you miss? What did you not see? What did the data not tell you? Evan would struggle with her questions, but with each answer he found, his understanding grew. He began to see the patterns she saw, to hear the silence she heard, to feel the rhythm of the battlefield. He learned that the greatest victories are not won with noise, but with silence. He learned that leadership is not about commanding with a loud voice, but about leading with a quiet presence. He learned that true strength is not about seeking glory, but about seeking the truth. Elara's grounding was in a way her final mission. She was a mentor, a teacher, a guide. She was passing on her legacy, not in a medal or a promotion, but in the quiet, precise actions of the men and women she had inspired. She was the ghost in the machine, the bug in the system, the phantom in the desert. News of Elara Thorne's unconventional flight began to spread throughout the military. She was a legend, a myth, a phantom. The pilots whispered her name, her story, her legend. Some saw her as a hero, a maverick who had dared to challenge the system. Others saw her as a rogue pilot. A cautionary tale: don't be like her, don't take the risk, don't go against the rules. But for those who knew the truth, for those who had seen her flight data, for those who had spoken with her, she was a teacher, a guide, a mentor. She was the quiet force that would change the military forever. Her legacy was not in a medal or a promotion. It was in the quiet, precise actions of the men and women she had inspired. Her story would live on, not in a loud, boastful speech, but in the silence, in the shadows, in the ghost in the machine. One day, a new batch of recruits arrived at the base. They were young, cocky, and full of bravado. They had heard the stories of Elara Thorne, the phantom pilot, but they didn't believe them. They saw her as a myth, a legend, a fairy tale. They didn't understand the truth in the mirror. Evan, now a seasoned pilot and a mentor to the new recruits, watched them from the same glass-paneled briefing room where Elara had once watched him. He saw the same bravado, the same arrogance, but he also saw something new, a quiet recruit, standing in the corner with a worn notebook in his hand. He was just like Evan had been, and just like Elara had been. He was a shadow, a ghost, a quiet force of nature. Evan approached him after the drill. "You observe more than you train," he said, the words a quiet echo of Elara's own. The young recruit looked up, startled, then smiled. "I'm learning," he said. Evan nodded. "Good," he said. "Good." He left the recruit to his work, his own notebook in his hand, a testament to the legacy he would carry. He knew that Elara's story would not be told in a loud, boastful speech, but in the quiet, precise actions of the men and women she had inspired. Her story would live on in the shadows, in the silence, in the unsaid words, a testament to the power of humility and the courage of the unseen hero.